Area 51 is that secret base out in Nevada where all kinds of mysterious things happen that you and I can talk about, and maybe we know what's going on out there, maybe we don't. Big debate. I believe it's called Area 51 because of the original project that went on out there in 1951. Information given to me by some of the sources that I interviewed at length for that book. But of course, everything about Area 51 is kind of a puzzle inside of a puzzle, so that's even debated. The actual origins, the original date, the origin story of Area 51. The Atomic Energy Commission was doing lots of nuclear testing out there in the middle of the desert, and they wanted to, keep what they were doing secret, and the CIA was kind of coming into existence with its programs, and the two merged in this idea of if you have a secret base inside of a secret place, you can do secret programs. Well, Area 51 has every organization you can imagine there over the decades. Military, intelligence community, Atomic Energy Commission. So everybody has their foot in Area 51, I think. I get the ideas of my books from the books I've written before. And when I was finishing up Area 51, I learned quite a bit about some Nazi scientists who were here working on programs. And I found this fascinating, in particular, a fellow by the name of Siegfried Kneemeyer, okay? Now, Kneemeyer was a very important Air Force technical intelligence person. And when he retired in the 70s, he was given the Defense Department's Distinguished Civilian Service Award. So that's kind of this incredibly high honor to get from the Pentagon. And when I looked into his past, I learned that he had been, during the war, during World War II, he had been one of the most important technical intelligence officers for Hermann Göring of the Luftwaffe. And he was given the highest award that you could be given there. And I thought, how does this happen? How do you work for one side and then work for the other side? And that is why I wrote Operation Paperclip. That was the springboard of that journey into that, narrative story. After the war, we brought as many as 1,600 Nazi scientists to create our weapons programs. And, this is something that really brings up a lot of moral questions. And what I found most intriguing about writing that book as a journalist, perhaps with all my books, is trying to maintain this neutral position and looking at both sides of the argument. Because, many people will tell you Paperclip was imperative. We had to bring those Nazi scientists to the United States in order to beat back the Russians. Others will tell you, how could we have possibly brought these, Nazis here? Some of them were war criminals. There's, DOD weapons policy for you in a nutshell, i.e., extremely complicated and always, two sides of the argument. The Pentagon's Brain, book number 3 for me. Okay, so that idea came from Paperclip when my editor, I was finishing up with Paperclip, and Wernher von Braun is probably the most famous Operation Paperclip scientist. Created our rocket program and then, really responsible for the Apollo program in many regards. He had been Hitler's rocket builder. And my editor at Little Brown asked me, when I was finishing up Paperclip, what went on with von Braun in such and such a year? And I looked into it and found out that this was in 1957, that this new agency was emerging at the Pentagon, and it was called ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. We now know it as DARPA with a D for defense. But when they were beginning this organization, the query was, who's the best scientist in America to lead this program, to lead all of American, military technology in what's called blue sky research. And they chose von Braun. And he was interviewed for the job, but his caveat to take the job was, yes, I'll take it, but I need to bring 12 of my colleagues from the rocket program. And they were all former Nazis. So that was the dividing line for the Pentagon. They said no. and they passed on von Braun being DARPA's first director. And, but the way that it came about of calling it the Pentagon's brain was really realizing that the Defense Department is looking at the great minds. That's what they're concerned with. They want to know who will lead us in technology of the future. I mean, you name it. I mean, the most famous is, of course, the Internet, which was originally called the ARPANET. But technologies like GPS, laser weapons, there's no end to what the Pentagon produces. There's reason to say that artificial intelligence is a DARPA product, biotechnology. So there is the idea that this is important to think about. DARPA is the most powerful and most productive military science agency in the world. And so few people know about it. That's pretty much why I wrote the book in a nutshell, because it was like, how can this agency be so significant, kind of changing and shaping our world, if you will, and yet its public perception is close to zero. Book number 4 for me that I have that just published last week is the idea of, well, the book is called Phenomena, and it's about the government's investigations into extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. Extrasensory perception, gaining knowledge through means other than the 5 known senses. Psychokinesis, the alleged ability to move matter with the mind. These are very controversial subjects, and subjects that many scientists will tell you is pseudoscience. Why I was super interested in writing about this was having come off of this very hard science book, The Pentagon's Brain. On the other side of the spectrum was what's sometimes called squishy science. But the Pentagon, the Defense Department, the intelligence community, they are interested in both of these subjects, and so am I. Yes. I mean, this goes back, by the way. Look, all roads leads back to the Nazis, I find, certainly when I'm investigating and reporting on Defense Department weapons programs and intelligence community intelligence collection programs. And ESP, psychokinesis, this whole idea of the phenomena leads back to the Nazis as well. So we're talking decades of research in this area, still going on today. But the original programs came from the idea that after the war, we had a intelligence collection unit called Operation Alsace. It actually began, in the end, when the war was still going on. And we sent our sort of finest scientists to try and capture Nazi technology. And we did. And this is the link between all of my books. So one of the cache of documents that we found, this links up to the book Phenomena, was part of Heinrich Himmler's science organization, which was called Das Ahnenerbe. And within that organization, Himmler was investigating extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, map dowsing. And when we got these documents, they became very interesting to a lot of individuals in the military intelligence community, particularly because guess who got the other half of the documents? The Russians. So anything that we knew they had as well, we were worried about who would win the race, and that is how the psychic arms race really began. Same way, over in the hard science department, you had the rocket arms race. That idea of getting man into space began with captured Nazi documents, V2s, and scientists, literally von Braun. Not at all. I mean, fate and circumstance kind of intervene in one's own life. I think that's why it's such an interesting concept for me to write about how, circumstance has a role in the path that one is on. I wanted to be a novelist when I was younger, and I went away to boarding school with a typewriter when I was 15, and I was going to be the great American novelist. And, decades passed, and that was not the case. And one of my mentors said to me, stop making things up. Pursue the truth. It's the truth that matters. She also pointed out that I had a little difficulty following direction, and that if I worked with an editor at a newspaper or a magazine, I would, learn how to follow direction. And that was exactly what I did. It was extraordinarily helpful for me, and I tell anyone who's interested in, struggling with writing to do that, because if you're willing to take criticism about your work and work with very smart individuals who can help you, streamline your ideas and pull out what's really important and send you on other paths and suggest you interview different people, that becomes, I think, an enormously powerful journey when you bring other great minds into the mix to kind of direct you, and then you kind of wind up where you're headed. At least that's my experience. Well, that was fate and circumstance intervening. I also think luck comes into play, And what was interesting writing the book on extrasensory perception and psychokinesis is a lot of the scientists who lean toward, let's say, the supernatural, talk about luck, and they talk about coincidence, and they say these fall into that category, believe it or not, of extrasensory perception. It's kind of intuition. It's a very squishy science concept to think about, but I like thinking about it, particularly because of this question that you brought up. So how does one get a lucky break, okay? You could say fortune favors the prepared mind. If you're always, reading and writing and thinking and working on subjects that are of interest to you, then circumstance intervenes and you are on your way. But specifically, with Area 51, I was at a dinner party seated next to a gentleman named Ed Lovick, who I had known for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. He was sort of a distant family member, always under the impression that he was an aircraft designer, because I knew he worked for Lockheed. And he leaned over to me one day, this must have been 2007 or 8, and he said, "Boy, have I got an interesting story for you." At the time I was reporting on terrorism. He said he was reading what I wrote and enjoyed reading it. So what was this interesting story, And he said, "The CIA just declassified my life's work. I invented stealth technology, or rather I was I was sort of the physicist that led the team. And this goes back to when Eisenhower was president." And so, as you can see, this is a remarkable lead for a reporter to get. I mean, I went to the CIA, and lo and behold, they had just declassified this aircraft program called Oxcart that took place out at Area 51. And so then I began to work with Lovick, talking to him about his role, the science and technology role in building this incredible aircraft. And I learned very quickly, there's a backstory to this backstory, and there's a lot of tangents that are super interesting, and they're all going to fall on the axis of Area 51. And that's how I got that idea for that book. Well, that's a great question. I mean, and it's very interesting in terms of U.S. national security, because when you think about what a powerful and potent site Area 51 is, as I report in the book, the fact that it remained almost unknown to the general population until the early 1990s is astonishing. I mean, talk about being able to keep a secret. I mean, I make the analogy in the book about the Manhattan Project, same idea, right? Even, Vice President Harry Truman did not know about, or Congress, the ones funding the program did not know about the program. So I think secret keeping is very interesting. I write about it in all of my books. But to your question, it wasn't until an individual named Robert Lazar, squeaked this bit of news out, which landed on the edge of conspiracy, and then Area 51 became known. And I think that is the origins of an extraordinary amount of conspiracy theory that grew out of that base and still exists about that base. And there's still things going on there now. Well, he was an interesting, let's say, engineer, and he was out there at the base, according to him, and he saw things that he believed were, yes, and although people will tell you he never worked there. I mean, again, you know, the myths inside the puzzles, inside the conundrums. But he stood by his position that he said he saw an alien, in essence. And then you get into these, as I was reporting the story, all these realms of black propaganda and, you know, I mean, did they dress someone up and make them look like an alien? Were they trying? I mean, this idea of mythology and, you know, misinformation and disinformation is part and parcel to Area 51, and really to all of the books that I have written. The subjects are conducive to that. Originally, when I was interviewing the scientists who worked there and the spies and the pilots, and they would call it Groom Lake, they would call it the ranch. There were all kinds of code names for it. And of course, what's fascinating, or was to me while I was writing the book, is that the actual word Area 51, the name Area 51, was classified when I was writing the book. It's since been declassified because President Obama referred to it publicly. That's a quick way to declassify something. But when I was looking at those documents we were talking about earlier, the Oxcart documents, you would be reading along, and then there'd be a small word redacted, like blacked over. And if you looked at it, you know, up to the light, or that's Area 51. And out of something like 7,000 pages of documents that I reviewed, I found 2 places where someone forgot to black out Area 51. So you would see it there, and it was an aha moment. He went on TV and, you know, made this claim and said that there were, you know, there was alien technology and that there was an alien out there. And, you know, people have been fascinated with UFOs and for millennium. I mean, that is... So this was like, you know, setting off a match in dry grass. I mean, the people went, you know, the story built, and it became kind of a firestorm. And I think that that has since become a great point of contention, and why Area 51 is on such a lockdown issue, because people will not move off of that idea that there are aliens out there. Many people believe that and still do. Every book is different. I mean, every book is different. There's kind of a dance, I think, that's done with journalists, because remember, the just basic job of the journalist is to inform the public. I mean, in spirit, you're really not even supposed to have an opinion. So one would think you would want to work with transparent elements of the government to also make things known. But I find in my experience that current, let's say, like the PR office of any of these agencies, they only want to present a certain message. And that's a message, not a fact, let's say. So where I do most of my reporting is in interviewing scientists who are retired, who worked on very significant programs for these individual agencies and are acutely aware of what they can speak of and what they cannot, because it's still classified. And because I also write about a lot of Cold War programs, things that were incredibly interesting and you know, involved extraordinary classification measures decades ago. Everyone wanted to know about them then, but could not. When they become declassified, sort of the public has moved on. And I find in my experience that by tracking down these scientists, the Superman of scientists, if you will, they are willing and you know, happy to share their stories about these incredible programs, because people have lost interest. And it's this idea that, you know, it's important to know the past to safeguard the future. And that's the greatest joy, I think, with working with defense scientists who are dedicated patriots, who believe in what they did, but are also, especially as they get older, willing to share the pitfalls, the failures. And the press office of any given military or intelligence agency does not want to talk about failure, period. They only want to talk about success. And I think there's a danger in that. I mean, that's a theme going through all of my books. It's not to, you know, ridicule a failure, but rather to demonstrate that failure is part of success, but we must be very careful and, about trying to cover up failures. I mean, it's sometimes said I wrote the book on Area 51, but if you imagine an iceberg and you think of how much of the iceberg you see and then how much is below the surface, I'm guessing, but if you planted a flag at the top of the iceberg, that's probably what I reported in a 450-page book. What has gone on there and what continues to go on boggles the mind. I mean, we could talk about, tunnel technology for 3 more hours. Just when you think you have what's going on at Area 51, there are a lot of tunnel systems at that base, things that are going on there. When will those be declassified? These are the great mysteries. I can't wait to write Area 52. Most definitely. I mean, my kids, I file so many FOIA requests that sometimes, they often come in the mail, and they're usually those 8x10 envelopes, and they say in the corner, NSA or DOD or, CIA, and they're the thin envelopes because that means you open up one sheet of paper and it says request non-responsive, meaning, sorry, we couldn't find any information. Every now and then you get a bigger envelope, and that's sort of a great moment of joy. I mean, that's what happened with Phenomena. I came home one day and there was a thick manila packet from the Central Intelligence Agency. A FOIA request had been granted, and there were, almost 1,000 pages of documents on these ESP and psychokinesis programs that became the basis of Phenomena. And that was super interesting. That's where I learned about, that the Apollo astronaut Ed Mitchell was doing ESP tests going to the moon. I mean, the little details inside these documents are just priceless. The way I got the idea to write Phenomena, sort of the spark, was researching Pentagon's brain. I was looking at the Apollo image library because so much of DARPA has to do with space. Okay, it was the launching point of the organization, and I found this image, and it shows an astronaut standing on the moon reading a document, and I thought, oh my God, this is an incredible image. You have advanced science, space travel, and proto-technology, writing, reading, in this one image. And I had to know what that astronaut was reading on the moon. First, I found out that it was Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14. Yes, so I went to interview him at his home in Florida. And I asked him, what were you reading on the moon? And he said that he was reading a map. So, this gets even better. Man on the moon reading a map of the moon. Why was he reading the map? Because he was lost. And that, to me, is just a brilliant, beautiful concept. It's so human, and it speaks to what we were just talking about with failures, right? How do you define failure? You have a program failure, but then you also have individual failure, and that often leads to people being lost or feeling like they're lost. And because I write narrative nonfiction, and because it's character-based, I care about the people I write about. I want to hear their story and how it becomes a metaphor for the bigger story. And so with Mitchell, when he told me the story of being lost on the moon, I was just, it's remarkable. The brief version, I write it at length in Phenomena, but what he said was, so part of the Apollo 14 mission, and of course keep in mind, Apollo 14 comes after Apollo 13, right? The failed moon mission, there was so much pressure on them to perform. And the geologists wanted them to go to Cone Crater and pull out samples, rock samples, and believed that these rock samples could perhaps reveal Earth's origins and the moon, right? What a concept. You can't have much more pressure on you. And so he and Alan Shepard, that was their mission. So they fly 240,000 miles to get to the moon. Mitchell was the pilot on the Antares lander. He lands within 87 feet of the target. And then they get lost locally, trying to find Cone Crater. It doesn't get more human. And they had to, you know, when they found out they were lost, and of course this speaks to many issues of perspective, you know, where do you think you are versus where are you really? In that airless environment, they became confused, and they told NASA, you can read all these transcripts, we're lost, we think we're here, we're there, NASA's trying to help them, the heart rates are going up. NASA gave them 30 more minutes, and they couldn't find their way to the crater, and they were told to go home, you know? And so hearing from Mitchell about this disappointment of going all the way there and missing what turned out to be the target by about 1,000 feet, you know, is just amazing. And he shared with me how disappointed he felt on the trip home from the moon. But looking out one of the 5 windows on that spacecraft, he had what he said was an epiphany. He looked out, and to him, he realized that man was more than he previously thought. So he became fascinated in that moment with the idea of consciousness, with the idea of man, what is man capable of? And that's why I think my new book, Phenomena, is really about the reaches of what can be known. Mitchell came home, quit NASA, divorced his wife, made all new friends, and began this trajectory into the world of ESP and psychokinesis. He suffered dearly because of it. Some say he got lost. That's not what Mitchell thinks. He was ridiculed. I mean, he was ridiculed. You cannot pull up any article on Ed Mitchell without kind of a snickering journalist pointing out that he conducted these ESP experiments on the way to and from the moon. And, you know, he suffered because of it. All of his colleagues were these hard scientists. He himself was. He has a PhD from MIT. But he had what is called a conversion moment. Again, another important theme in the book Phenomena. You have scientists, physicists, individuals who have these conversion moments when dealing with extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, and they become absolutely convinced of the reality of the phenomena, and they pursue it. You know, some pursue it to the gates of hell, as I write in the book, and others maintain a very scientific attitude toward it. But because the scientific skeptic community insists that this is pseudoscience, because, rightly so, psychokinesis, extrasensory perception, it does not pass scientific method muster. The 5 steps that every scientist agrees must, you know, you must adhere to move from hypothesis to general theory. The most important being that it's repeatable. Well, ESP experiments aren't repeatable. Those, you know, pro this work say it's fickle by nature, and those against it say that's hogwash. But I love this battle. There's a real battle between, you know, science versus supernatural, if you will. And again, it speaks to this idea of what are the far reaches of what man can know. I mean, there's doubt, absolutely, there's doubt everywhere, but, you know, the CIA concluded that the phenomena was real, but they couldn't repeat it. But they said it doesn't take away from the fact that these real laboratory experiments happened. But now, what I found most interesting in reporting Phenomena, the book, was that when I began researching and reporting, I was under the impression that the programs were buttoned up in the mid-1990s with the kind of downfall of this one big Defense Department program. But I was astonished to learn that they're actually back today under the rubric of advanced cognition. Okay, so the Defense Department is now merging this idea of the biological, the 6th sense. The Office of Naval Research calls it the spidey sense. But instead of the parapsychologists of the 70s and 80s, now the Defense Department is employing neurobiologists, computer technologists, computer engineers. They are taking individuals who have the spidey sense, it's just a dressed up word for ESP, and they're looking at their brains, and they're trying to model what's going on in their brains, and then, of course, to accelerate it, and ultimately weaponize it, because that's the role of the Defense Department. No, I mean, but I will, you know, the Harvard experimental psychologist Gertrude Schmeidler back in the 50s, created this system to talk about how individuals approach this controversial subject matter. And she said on the one side there were goats, okay? Goats were the scientific skeptics who said this is nonsense, this is hogwash, you know, forget about all of it. Sheep, on the other hand, were those who were open to the idea of ESP, of psychokinesis. And I would say I began as the neutral journalist, but looking at many of these experiences, reporting, you know, looking at documents, declassified documents, and seeing what the Defense Department thinks, what the CIA thinks, talking to the scientists, talking to the physicists, talking to the psychics, I kind of shifted a little bit toward sheep. Like, I am open to the idea that it is unknown, that you know, the conclusions are not yet in. I really think that is the idea of the far reaches of what can be known. For me, it's wiser to lean sheep, to not discount, not throw out the baby with the bathwater, if you will. Oh my goodness. I mean, that's right. That's what everyone, I mean, so I interviewed, you know, 75 people for Area 51, all of whom had direct access to that base, all of whom went on record. One source remained anonymous with me because he gave me what was then, or what still is, according to him, classified information. He was an Atomic Energy Commission scientist. And he told me this shocking story in the end of the Area 51 book. You know, it takes up 12 pages at the end of the book, and it's what, you know, garners the most curiosity. And what he told me was that there was a program out there that he worked on, which was a black propaganda program, to create creatures that looked like aliens. And it involved human experimentation. And he was very parsimonious with the details, but he was very succinct with going on the record about this. And, you know, I interviewed him for over 100 hours. And by the way, stayed in contact with him after the book published, and continued to have discussions with him. And he sticks by that idea. So the read on Area 51, as I tell the story as he told it to me, is they were not aliens. This doesn't mean that there's not extraordinary material that continues to, you know, swirl around the cauldron about why his information is incorrect. It's a big puzzle, but I really appreciated his candor with me, and I stand by everything that he spoke of and that I reported in the book, and he stood by it all the way to his death. All of the programs I write about, almost all of them, are what are called special access programs, SAP programs. They exist in these very secret classification protocols that are far above normal classified protocols. So it is almost impossible to accurately say what the budgets are. One of the budgets I can give you is the DARPA budget. That's public. So DARPA spends $3 billion a year. And that is the case, that's basically been the same figure if you adjust it for inflation going back to DARPA's origin in 1958. It's an extraordinary amount of money for 120 program managers. But that's only the public figure. So all of the programs are dealing with black budgets, which means that the money is essentially unknowable. On that subject, I'll give you one fascinating detail that I find that maybe stands as the best analogy for all of this. So in Area 51, one of the kind of creators of Area 51, if you will, was Richard Bissell. He was deputy director of the CIA. And the way in which he became involved in Area 51, if you back up a couple years, he got a call from Alan Dulles at CIA saying, hey, listen, Bissell. At the time, Bissell was in charge of the Marshall Fund, okay? That was the plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. An extraordinary amount of money. Bissell was in charge of it. And Dulles said, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is the essence, can you skim some of that money off of the Marshall Fund and give it to us for a secret program? Bissell said, are you sure, again, paraphrasing, you sure I should do this? Yes. Bissell did it, and years later he found out when he was made sort of the director of the Area 51 project, remember that money you gave us? Here's what it went to. This is how Area 51 was set up. So these things are, and interestingly, Bissell talks about that in his memoir. So you can find information, I as a reporter, find information in a whole array of places, from memoirs to, you know, papers that are stored at different archives, individuals' journals, sometimes the family gives me access to them, FOIA requests, interviews. This is the joy of being a journalist. You have many different sources you're pulling from to try and piece together the story for the reader as best you can. I mean, almost all of them. You know, I begin the Pentagon's brain with this, talk about a colossal failure. I mean, and again, others will say this was a colossal win. So the Castle Bravo bomb. I mean, this was a thermonuclear weapon. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb. And it's, you know, the average person thinks, oh, atomic weaponry, thermonuclear bombs, same cookie sheet. Well, perhaps, except for in orders of magnitude. I mean, thermonuclear weapons can one thermonuclear weapon could take out the eastern seaboard. There was one thermonuclear weapon exploded in Castle Bravo, the Castle Bravo bomb out in the Marshall Islands. I begin the Pentagon's brain with it. You know, from the perspective of witnesses who were there, who told me their story. When I say colossal failure, it was supposed to be 6.5 megatons, but it went out of control. I mean, Teller's calculation and all the scientists working with him, they couldn't, you know, predict the future. They couldn't predict their own science experiment. And instead, it was a runaway thermonuclear bomb, 15 megatons. I mean, just an astonishing amount of power, energy, and apocalyptic by its very nature. I mean, he's a super interesting character. I mean, many people, again, would say he had hubris and that he was trying to outdo his arch rival Oppenheimer, right? Other people will say he saved us from, you know, Soviet invasion because, you know, he pushed the idea of the development of the thermonuclear bomb, which some of his colleagues, by the way, called the evil thing, okay? They did not think, these are Manhattan Project scientists, they did not think it should be developed because it could end the world. Teller pushed for it and ultimately won. Yes, I mean, he gets pulled into the program during the Reagan administration. I mean, and again, I've interviewed people who swear by his beneficence. And when I say that, I mean, because the Castle Bravo bomb, which was a secret program, no one even knew it went on at the time, you know, we found out later that the Russians were only, you know, literally months behind us in the development of their thermonuclear weapon. And in this idea of the battle of the superpowers, a theme through all of the books, you know, the U.S. government must stay ahead. And what's interesting is it does stay ahead. So to give credit where credit is due, and when I was interviewing DARPA scientists who said, when we got into the realm of, you know, cloning, let's say, I mean, you've got thermonuclear weapons as part of the origin story, and today you have, you know, autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, biohybrids, human cyborgs. This is all DARPA science. And the DARPA scientists would say to me, when I would ask questions like, is this wise? They would say, well, what if you were to wake up tomorrow morning and find out that the Chinese or the Russians or even a dark horse like Saudi Arabia presented the world with the first clone, human clone? You know, would Americans say, my God, we've been beaten by an enemy nation? That's why DARPA exists. That's why these weapons program exists. That's why Area 51 exists. It's why Paperclip existed. We must stay ahead of the rest of the world so that we are not beaten by technological surprise. And so far we have. I mean, I use that as an example whenever anyone says, oh, come on, you can't really believe the government can keep secrets. They're not capable of doing that. You know, it's a conspiracy to think otherwise. Well, I cite exactly that. I mean, Of course the government can and does keep secrets. And then the other side of the argument is it needs to. Well, he was the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, and also of so we're going back in time now to the years right before America entered World War II. And there was an extraordinary sense of isolationism in America. You know, we didn't want to enter the war and didn't feel that we needed to or should. But at the same time, the president needed to make sure that we were keeping up with the science and technological advances that we knew the Nazis were making, thanks to people like Einstein, who had already come here, you know. So you have secret science. That's really where I think secret science began, with Vannevar Bush and with these pre-war technologies. America was hedging her bets, rightly so, because, you know, you can't start your atomic weapons program when the Nazis are working on their triggering system. You know, you've touched upon a very important theme for this, not only the individuals who work on their programs, but their families. And it's why I love tracking down and interviewing the children, if the parents have passed, the scientists, because you can kind of get a sense of that secrecy. The children knew nothing in many cases, and also the wives knew nothing. But a lot of times they have and will share, you know, father's papers that are stored in the attic. And so that becomes, this idea of legacy, I think, is very interesting. And I particularly found that when I worked on Paperclip, and I went to Germany and interviewed the children of some of these major Nazis who worked for Hitler and then later worked for the Department of Defense. You know what? It was either black or white. I mean, and that really was astonishing. It was either, no, I don't want to talk to you. Father didn't do anything wrong. Never mind, he was a convicted war criminal. I'm speaking specifically about a convicted war criminal named Otto Ambros, who was Hitler's chemical weapons developer. And he was convicted of, as I write in Paperclip, he was convicted of mass murder, slavery, genocide, sent to Landsberg prison after the Nuremberg trials, and then was released by our U.S. High Commissioner, John McCloy, and went back into the world and then consulted for the Atomic Energy Commission. I mean, when I did track down his son and tried to interview him, he said, my father did nothing wrong, he was acquitted. On the other hand, I interviewed other children of major Nazis who had a very different take and were very thoughtful and remorseful and courageous in sharing with me the profound difficulty of, you know, that legacy that they must live with. I mean, on the one hand, the son cannot be judged by the father, but psychologically it's an extraordinary burden to bear. So interviewing people who were that forthcoming with me about, you know, the complications of that legacy, I mean, I feel like that undergirds the book with significance that's deeply emotional. I mean, they were in every weapons program that we were financing, there was a top Nazi. I mean, that's a gross generalization, but I think it is also very accurate, certainly from my reporting. I mean, in my book, I focus on 21 of the Nazis who I found to be extreme cases. Extreme meaning during the war, they worked directly with Hitler, Himmler, you know, Speer. And so when you think about that then they were working for us, with us, that's real drama in there. So I looked at 21, but there are 1,600. And just from looking at those big files and sort of mapping out where everyone went, yes, they were in every one of our weapons program. Kurt Debus. You know, they still give out the Kurt Debus Award to kind of the most innovative thinker in this world. And I was shocked to find out this because of the documents that I was able to get from a Freedom of Information Act. indicate that Debus was a hardcore Nazi. I mean, he even wore the SS uniform to work in Nazi Germany. He turned in a colleague, ratted out a colleague for saying mean things about Hitler, literally, and this guy got picked up by the Gestapo. And, you know, we're giving him an award. I mean, this kind of thing is astonishing. I called up the head of the organization that gives that award, and, you know, he was very defensive, and he said Debus was a great innovator, and he, you know, did all these things for the Apollo program. And I said, but what do you say to the person who says to you, he was a Nazi? And his response was very interesting. He said, no one's ever asked me that question before. So we have journalism to present the facts and let people decide what they think about those facts. Very important question. Absolutely not. And from the declassified documents, I learned that not only did NASA know about their past, but they were complicit in making sure that this did not get out. This was a kind of a quote from one of the von Braun documents, because von Braun, he was always being kind of pulled into it by journalists who would ask him questions about his Nazi past. He was told by NASA to say, if you're asked, your answer should be, I've been thoroughly investigated by the U.S. military. And he had been thoroughly investigated. They just didn't reveal what the investigation had found. I have not been to DARPA's headquarters. They're very secretive about letting anybody in there. I mean, they like to present the idea that they are a beneficent organization. And, you know, they do some great things. We have the internet. The results of a lot of their work have profoundly impacted society and made it easier for a lot of people. But let's face it, DARPA's job, as was indicated in its early mandate, you know, in 1958, is to create vast weapon systems of the future. So DARPA is very, you know, secretive about letting anyone in and seeing what's really going on. Area 51, no journalist has ever been there, including me. I was taken by a group of former Manhattan Project scientists when they were still alive to the Nevada, what was then called the Nevada test site, which is, you know, all the other areas 1, 2, 10, 15, 20, that align with Area 51. Area 51 sort of over the hill. I was actually in the test site, which is where all the bomb craters are, and you're kind of driving through the desert, and you see where, you know, an old safe was blown up, like a big giant bank safe, to try and, these were parts of the test to see what would survive a small nuclear blast. Train tracks, you know, the rubble that's out there in the desert is remarkable. The area is all, you know, concealed. So I went there and I kind of saw Area 51 5 miles away, but that's the closest I got to it. So thanks for the question. Remote viewing, for those who might not know, is another word for extrasensory perception. And it was a term created by the CIA in the 1970s to destigmatize the concept of ESP, the concept of psychics, of psychic functioning. It became part and parcel to all of the programs that went on for the next 25 years across the CIA, across the Department of Defense, over at DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency. And as I write in the book Phenomena, there are extraordinary success stories of remote viewing, locating hostages, locating downed aircraft. There are also colossal failures. And again, I tell both of those stories in the book, and I let you decide. But when you look at the facts of what some of these psychics were able to accomplish, were able to see, to know the unknowable, with a CIA or Defense Department handler sitting with them inside of what is usually a Faraday cage, an electronically shielded room. So there's no way they could be getting information any other way, other than this mysterious sixth sense, which no one has been able to explain. So I would say the remote viewing success stories exist, and I write about them in the book. Great question. So let's talk about GPS, okay? I mean, satellite technology interestingly finds some of its origins at Area 51. Richard Bissell, who we talked about earlier, the sort of mayor of Area 51, along with Dr. Bud Whelan, who I interviewed for the book, they were working early satellite technology as they were running these airplane technology programs. They were also experimenting with satellites, hoped it would work. I mean, think about that as a concept in terms of innovation. Our whole military runs, you know, with the satellite system being at the center. But in the 50s and 60s, these ideas were just coming online. And there was a mandate over at the Defense Department to, you know, create what we now know as GPS through satellite technology. And it took decades to really come to fruition. But when DARPA finally was able to make these systems work, and this is kind of at the end of the Vietnam War, this was it was a military targeting technology, GPS that you have in your smartphone, okay? And it was kept secret. It had an offset by a couple hundred feet, so if anyone hacked into our system, they wouldn't be able to target, you know, their bombs would be off in essence. And it was kept secret all the way through the 90s, and during the Clinton administration, word came down that a European civilian organization was going to develop GPS for the consumer. And that is why the Clinton administration declassified GPS technology, because we wanted America to be able to be the innovators and the primary drivers of that in the commercial world, and that's exactly what you see. I sure do. They called Ingo Swann the original super psychic, and he played a very significant role in the early years of the CIA program and also in the years of the Defense Department program. So there's quite a bit you can read about in Phenomena about Swann. He was a very charismatic person and a fascinating character. The Scientology question is very interesting. Of course, the intelligence community and the Defense Department were extremely anti-Scientologists. But you're absolutely correct that Ingo Swann and others in the program had been involved in Scientology. And it becomes a great point of contention, and it also there are some mysteries that remain. And I think the biggest mysteries that remain surround a psychic that worked at the same time as Ingo Swann for the CIA, and his name was Pat Price. And Pat Price sort of, he outperformed Ingo Swann in the psychic realm, if you will, because whereas Swann was incredibly gifted at describing, you know, using his ESP talents, if you will, to describe situations narratively, colorfully, Pat Price could pull actual names, numbers, figures off of documents in classified facilities thousands of miles away. And he was so good at this that a number of security investigations, high-level investigations, came down on him because people could not possibly fathom how he could know what he did. He died in 1975 under very mysterious circumstances. Many conspiracies have arisen about what he died. One of them is that the Church of Scientology killed him. Oh, yes. I mean, I did this great event with one of the scientific skeptics named Professor Michael Shermer at Caltech, and this was for the Area 51 book. And he filled this auditorium. I mean, it must have sat 400 people. And because it's in Pasadena, right near JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, it was sort of like half of the people in the room were these big brains from JPL, and the other half were conspiracy theorists. And, you know, we had this lively, raucous debate, not just me asking questions, but then the questions started going back and forth, and sometimes they weren't questions, sometimes they were like shouting at one another. But I think these are all important readers to have, because I find that conspiracy theories often have roots in truth. And I write about this in every one of my books, where you have an alleged conspiracy theory, which is actually, you know, part of a black propaganda campaign or a disinformation campaign. And again, I'm able to unearth these documents, have them declassified, and demonstrate that things are not always exactly as they seem. No. They're all a product of that race, the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And often China comes in. A little too inside baseball for me. I interviewed Lazar for the book Area 51. I write about my interview with him. But what I think the caller or the individual is speaking to, the fact that these ideas, these mysteries, some would call them conspiracies, these are not going away. People continue to be interested because they feel that their questions have not been answered. And that, of course, speaks to this idea that we've been talking about, transparency, government transparency. What can be known? What should be known? Why do we have to wait decades to have these documents declassified? Janet Airlines is the private airlines that flies from Las Vegas to Area 51. It has its own conspiracies within conspiracies. I had someone contact me just recently and say, give me the Janet Airline schedules, and they stop flying during the day apparently, and they only fly at night. Again, these mysteries and conspiracies fold within one another, and they don't want to end. You have to be invited, many places, certainly Area 51, you have to be invited out there. But what is interesting is, in all of my books, researching, the supermen or interviewing the supermen of science, lo and behold, almost everybody says, oh, by the way, I read your Area 51 book, and I was out there, and then they tell me the little program that they were on. Dale Graff, one of the leading scientists in my new book, Phenomena, he was out at Area 51. And I said, Dale, that's incredible. Tell me, what were you doing out there? I can't tell you. It's a great question, and there's another former Nazi general, Operation Paperclip scientist, who wound up at Bell, and that was Walter Dornberger, and I write about him in Operation Paperclip as well. So von Braun had an interesting trajectory. He worked all the way through the Apollo program and then retired and went into private enterprise, and then he was stricken with cancer and died. But von Braun comes up in every one of my books. There's a fascinating story where he loops in with in the book that I've just written, Phenomena, with Uri Geller, of all people, who was a CIA asset and who had the Defense Department very concerned with psychokinesis. So spoon bending, what Geller does, and many people tell you that he's a magician. The DOD did not think so. The CIA did not think so. And they were concerned that what Geller could do with psychokinesis was think of the delicate electronic system in an ICBM. They were concerned if Geller could bend a spoon with the tip of his finger, that using his mind, he could do the same, he could disrupt the electronic system. And so when he came to the United States, he met with Wernher von Braun. And there's a photograph I have of the two of them in Phenomena. But von Braun was fascinated with Geller. Geller got von Braun's watch to stop, and he made this statement, I have no scientific explanation for how he did this. And Geller got an old desk calculator that von Braun had that had stopped working. Geller got it to start working just by touching it. And, this mystified von Braun. And because he was such a powerful figure in the science community, it raised a lot of eyebrows that von Braun was, taken with Geller. It does. That's the remote viewing program. And one of the things that I demonstrate, over time happened with the Phenomena program was that the CIA was under the impression that this talent, which was still in the hypothesis stage, this, let's call it enhanced intuition or enhanced perception. The CIA doctors believed that it's biological, that it's individualistic, that use the Mozart analogy. Think of how I know I cannot sing in the shower, and then you listen to Mozart's amazing music, and, wow, that's different, that's biology, okay? That's the metaphor that the CIA used because they believed that individual people, Ingo Swann, Pat Price, Uri Geller, had some kind of extraordinary gift that the rest of us didn't. The Defense Department took a different approach. They believed that soldiers could be trained to become psychic. And grave problems arose because the CIA advised against this. The Defense Department pursued it, and it led to a lot of problems within these programs, because in many cases you had soldiers, trying to be psychic and having very little success. And at the same time, you had individual people who were actually psychic, if you will, working on these programs and having success, and it created a catch-22, because the Defense Department didn't want to believe that people were psychic because it flew in the face of science. This is a very important subject, defense contracting. It speaks to what Eisenhower said on his farewell speech about the military-industrial complex. And the warning area that I saw was when I was reporting the Pentagon's brain. And I learned that the Jason scientists, okay, so now if you want to talk conspiracy, the Jason scientists come up in all the world of conspiracy. So they are allegedly this, before I interviewed a lot of the Jasons, one idea is that they're kind of the Illuminati of the defense science world. So I interviewed Marvin Goldberger, who everyone calls Murph, right before he died, who was the founder of the Jasons and worked on many of these DARPA projects for decades. And the Jason scientists, what I found to be most interesting was they were full-time professors, at the great universities across America, and part-time defense scientists. So they would get together in the summer and solve for DARPA whatever conundrums DARPA was facing. They were called the Supermen of science. And what I learned in the recent era, in the modern era, is there has been a shift. And the Defense Department, DARPA in particular, has kind of moved the Jason scientists to the side. They still consult, but they're not as important, I was told. And what is important now in terms of setting policy and making decisions about what science projects will be pursued in the future is in an organization inside the Pentagon called the Defense Science Board, the DSB. And as I write very specifically in the Pentagon's brain, if you look at the individuals who are on the Defense Science Board, they are almost all full-time defense contractors. They are not part-time defense scientists. And so what you have is what Eisenhower warned us against, which is the very people who are deciding which weapon systems, which vast weapon systems of the future the Pentagon will pursue, are the same individuals who stand to make an extraordinary amount of money on those weapon systems. DARPA is directorless at the moment, but DARPA is really managed by these 120 program managers. As I said earlier, $3 billion in the hands of 120 program managers. They have extraordinary power to stop and start programs. They look outside of the military establishment as well and work with universities and research labs. So profoundly innovative. This is the true definition of blue sky research. DARPA leads. The question is, do we like where they're leading us? And the answer is, you don't have a need to know about that, because most of the really intense programs that DARPA is working on, artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, these are classified programs. Well, the way the money flows from DARPA is it flows out of DARPA into the hands of the laboratories that are developing the weapons programs. So yes, if Apple has a product that DARPA wants to develop, they would be paid. Does that answer the question? Well, I would say the return on the investment happens in the civilian sector. If you make a product, let me maybe give a better example. So I interviewed for the Pentagon's brain some scientists who are working down at UC Irvine on limb regeneration, okay? This is the idea. Think of the salamander. Loses its tail, it grows back, okay? These scientists believe that humans will one day be capable of regenerating their own limbs. Extraordinarily interesting to DARPA in terms of, wounded warriors. But this kind of research is 20, 30 years out. What the scientists at Irvine told me is, who's going to fund that? No one, except for DARPA. So DARPA is willing to invest in very early laboratory research that leads to extraordinary new things. The scientists that I spoke to and that I write about in the book working on this program were very grateful for this funding from DARPA because it allows them to continue their research and to seek grants elsewhere. So there is a give and take in this world that has to do with money coming in and new programs going out. Well, Goldblatt was the individual who really took biological science to a new level. Okay, so back up for a minute. Researching the Pentagon's brain, I was fascinated by the idea that the hard science of those days, missile technology, weapon, did not involve biological scientists. So that happened, ironically, when the wall came down. And you had Soviet biological weapons engineers defecting to the United States and bringing with them the big reveal that the Soviets were breaking the biological weapons treaty and developing these horrific weapons, mixing things like Ebola and influenza, okay, to create apocalyptic results. So when these scientists arrived and began working for DARPA, it led to this idea of we need to look inside the body. We need to look at human biology. And that's where Goldblatt enters the scene, because about that same time, we're now kind of in the 90s, okay, the early 90s, and computer technology is getting small, so we're moving toward nanotechnology. And the Defense Department now becomes very interested in the idea of human physiology, what individual soldiers are capable of, how you can enhance that, and how you can ultimately create a super soldier. And, Goldblatt led the way all the way through the late 90s and early 2000s, and there was a lot of kickback from this from the public. One of the programs, I think, that sums this up was something called the Robo-Rat, okay? So the idea was ultimately to be able to put computer technology inside humans. And an early prototype was the rat. So they wired up this rat, and they were able to, with a chip in his brain, DARPA scientists were able to steer the rat through a maze. Well, people cried foul and said, this is right at the edge of ethics, and you cannot be doing this kind of thing. It's only going to lead in a bad direction. And so the programs were somewhat curtailed. Well, then 9/11 happened, and there was an extraordinary amount of funding. And now these DARPA programs today that I write about at length in the Pentagon's brain involve, pushing the biology of humans in another direction and ultimately merging man and machine to create what used to be relegated to science fiction, and that is the human cyborg. He did. I mean, and he was recruited by DARPA. It's a pretty interesting story about how, he developed a system that dealt with a sterilization technology for McDonald's on the wake of one of those bacteria scandals that, really put the fast food restaurants in a lot of trouble. And so the sterilization technology, he thought there has to be a military application for this. And DARPA agreed with him, and he ended up becoming a very powerful player there. Edgar Mitchell came back from the moon after that epiphany, quit NASA, divorced his wife, made all new friends, and started this organization. It had a couple different names in the early years, but it became a front for the CIA. And I found that fascinating. He became very involved in all of this, and he is actually the individual who brought Geller to the United States, and he was the front for the CIA in doing that because Geller was such a hugely popular figure. They needed to mask the idea that he was actually being tested by the CIA at the Stanford Research Institute. So we've talked a lot about conspiracies and how they kind of weave their way through this. Because I write about these subjects from a CIA or DOD filter, for me it's interesting to look at how these organizations deal with these subject matters. And usually it creates great problems. So because for example, in the book Phenomena, if you're prone to ESP, if you're prone to psychokinesis, for a lot of these individuals, that leads to other ideas that are along the lines of what the caller was talking about. And as I report in the book, it became a real problem at DOD because they didn't know how to set ground rules. Like, you can think and talk about aliens, but it has to occur at home, outside of the military environment. And instead, you had a couple of these individuals, these soldiers, who were using government time, government money, to conduct their own experiments using remote viewing, using ESP, to try to, do all these sort of ideas that the caller's talking about and locate aliens around the world. And, the declassified documents on this are fascinating because DOD did not know how to put a lid on this because they were concerned, I don't know if it was upsetting people or they just didn't. And so it created a colossal problem, and ultimately it kind of led to the downfall of the program. Yes, and I write about them in the book, in Phenomena, because it's important to address both sides of the aisle on this issue. There's no doubt that magicians can bend spoons using predigitation. That's what they call it. I mean, you can watch 1 million YouTube videos demonstrating exactly that. The question is whether or not Uri Geller or someone like him can bend a spoon not using a magic trick. And I write at length about that debate, that battle. That is science versus supernatural at its heart. Yes. I interviewed Randy for the book. I am fascinated by, because I write about war and weapons, I'm fascinated by battles and feuds, both personal, political, global. And Randy and Uri Geller had this decades-long battle over this subject. They both, all these decades later, stand by their ideas. One says this is hogwash, the other says this is a biological talent. So the reader might be interested to see that debate play out as it does in Phenomena, hopefully from a neutral point of view, showing different declassified documents on the subject, showing what the DOD thought of Randy, what they thought of Geller, what they were saying, how they all played a role because their feud elevated all of this to a public dialogue. So that is interesting also because here they are making this an issue and the Defense Department and the CIA are trying to keep it all secret. So your first question is super interesting to me because it speaks to the origins of the psychic program. And again, it pulls from that original cache of Nazi documents that were discovered by Operation Alsos after the war. So one of the early ideas that the CIA was following with psychokinesis, with ESP, had to do with psychopharmacology, which is a fancy name for drugs. This pulled from an old Aztec legend of hallucinogenic mushrooms. The idea that the shaman would take hallucinogenic mushrooms and their divinatory powers would be enhanced. So they'd be able to tell you what was happening, what was going to happen in the future, or tell you who stole your donkey, okay? So it had like prophecy and intelligence collection. This got the CIA's attention, and they hired a man, a medical doctor who was at the Army Chemical Center named Andrea Puharich. And, he has a foot in many conspiracy theories as well because he was someone who worked on the MK Ultra programs. So again, these themes weave through all of my books with elements of truth. Yes, there really was a program that the CIA ran, MK Ultra, Subproject 58, that sought to pursue hallucinogenic mushrooms for intelligence collections purposes. One of the details I found fascinating on this subject was that the CIA sent one of its scientists to this is in 1953, to one of the largest mushroom growers in America, made a secret deal with them, and said, you know, and the plan was, didn't reveal to the mushroom grower, but that we were going to find these hallucinogenic mushrooms in Mexico and then bring them back to the United States and farm them and do all these, you know, the volume of the experiments that the CIA intended seemed pretty significant based on these documents. But of course, the program, the scientist who led this mission, he was, of all things, a banker from J.P. Morgan named Wasson. And after he came back from Mexico with these hallucinogenic mushrooms, he wrote a huge magazine article about it in Time magazine and blew the cover on the program, so the CIA's mushroom program fell by the wayside. And you must be careful of the rabbit hole, because you do go down a lot of tunnels, and I think also it's important to realize that some of these programs dead end, and they really do dead end, or they end. Others have different incantations or get rebooted and rebranded, like the psychic programs of today. Thank you for that question. That's one that's near and dear to my heart, which has to do with process. It also has to do with early failure, let's say, you know, a theme I'm interested in, meaning I've been writing for a very long time, since I was 15, went to boarding school with a typewriter. And no one was really reading what I was writing for decades. And so the fact now that I have the great privilege of having people read me inspires me to keep at it and to keep writing. And I encourage anyone who is writing to continue, you know, to sort of follow that idea, because I think the only failure is quitting. So if you just keep at it. You know, how do I schedule my writing? I mean, I write full time, and I'm always thinking about what I'm writing and why I'm writing it, and looking at what's happening in the current climate of the world and trying to balance out what are really the concerns that we want to be thinking about today, and filtering that back to where did a lot of these problems come from and where are the solutions. I love the Eisenhower idea. In his farewell speech, he spoke of the military-industrial complex that is so famous. But what often gets left out of that is what he said in the second part of that speech, where he talked about an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. And he said that that is how you balance security and liberty. What a simple idea, just being alert and knowledgeable. And that's how I approach all of my books. I try to be alert, and I read a lot to be knowledgeable, and then I get to go out and interview the people who are on the ground doing the hard work and tell their stories in my book so that others can read them. I always hate to talk about the next topic, but I'm actually not going to talk. I mean, I'm going to hint at it. I'm writing about the CIA, and it's a really interesting new story. I most definitely write at home. I have an office. I live in Los Angeles, and I have an office kind of, you know, through the garden. I take a little garden pathway, and that's my office out there, freestanding, and it's small enough not to be distracted. Well, my computer is most definitely connected to the internet. I mean, I'm able to kind of not look at the internet all the time, but it is a huge resource for me. But I also do a lot of writing longhand. Certainly that's how I begin my chapters, because I find the brain, the human brain, no matter how much technology we have around, it works at its own speed. At least mine does. And so for me, the process of writing kind of is like similar to my thought processes. So once I have information and I know how to begin a chapter, I write it out longhand. Usually the first couple pages are always written that way. Sometimes. Kevin's my husband. The new book is dedicated to Kevin, Jet, and Finley, my children. Look, the joy of writing is so that I get to hang out with my family. I mean, they're a super source of inspiration for me because, you know, that has to do with the quality of life, right? So if you enjoy your life, if you love who you're with, then you are inspired, I think, to do interesting and challenging things. My husband is a commercial actor, has been forever. He's been in every commercial you can imagine. You name it. Milk, cars, beer. He does. I mean, we're both entrepreneurs, and, you know, in this world we live in where you're creative and entrepreneurial and thoughtful. We've been married for coming up on 21 years. It's a book about an archaeological quest. I mean, I love quest stories. I think that they're part and parcel to human nature. They always bring in the idea of success and failure, and then also this idea of who are we and where did we come from? I mean, the more we learn about the past, I think it gives us ideas about the future, about where we're going, which takes me back to phenomena, the reaches of what can be known. I'm always fascinated when we have this is the way the world was, and then, oh, archaeology reveals, actually, it was a little different. That's a great question. I mean, I think maybe it goes all the way back to John von Neumann, who I write about in The Pentagon's Brain. I call him the original Pentagon's Brain. And he was kind of the inventor of the first computer that contained its own instructions. We're talking in the 1940s now, in the basement of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study, where Einstein was. Von Neumann created this computer he called the Maniac. It was essentially like a giant calculator. But what was interesting, so when you ask, like, where are we now, I go back to that because for this reason. This is an amazing anecdote. Von Neumann was so smart. I mean, he was a polymath. And he built this computer, and originally, we're like in 1947 now, his assistants, he would try to beat the computer at a numerical calculation. And his assistants would feed him the calculations, and he would compute them in his brain, and he was able to beat the computer originally. And then one day, in the late 1940s, the computer beat von Neumann. And really, it's this profound moment. And right then and there, von Neumann said that he believed that one day computers would be able to think, that idea of sentience. So that's like really looking far off. And what we have today in the smartphone, you know, pulls back to that origin story. I mean, in the smartphone, iPhone's first generation smartphone had more technology than NASA had, more computer technology than NASA had when it sent Ed Mitchell to the moon. Think about that. Who's thinking about the future? Certainly someone like John von Neumann, certainly almost all of the scientists that DARPA employs. Licklider, again, he's called the Johnny Appleseed of the internet because he did plant the first seeds. He was a DARPA scientist called upon in the JFK era, to do something about what's called C2 in military jingo, command and control, okay? So think of technology. We're talking about the iPhone. Go back to 1962, JFK looking at a red phone, right? The red phone. That's the phone that if you think there's a nuclear strike, you have to call Khrushchev, okay? And that think about the dialing capacity on a rotary phone. And DARPA was brought on board to try and speed that up using computers. I mean, at the time, computers were the size of a room. So Licklider was brought in to speed up this C2 process. And while he was working on those programs there at the Pentagon, he came up with this idea. He sent out this very famous memo among computer technologists, which was where he came up with this idea that one day people would be able to communicate via computers. I mean, he was really talking about the internet in his mind, but he called it the intergalactic computer network. And it was going to be this symbiotic relationship between man and machine. He planted those original seeds for the ARPANET. He left, and many capable people took over and built the internet. And then you have this today linking up to that technology in our phones. So what man is capable of thinking about is astonishing. What are the reaches of what we can know? What will we know next? Well, that has to do with my husband's Norwegian, so my kids are Norwegian. And also, I love myths. I mean, I love the idea of storytelling. I love archetypes. Carl Jung plays a role in my new book, Phenomena, for that reason. The archetypes of the unconscious, These are basic tenets of narrative storytelling. And they're also basic tenets, I think, of how people live their lives, how they strive, what they strive for. Do they want to be the hero, That's an archetype. That's part of mythology. You love... I'm thinking that maybe at home you're Googling some of these conspiracy theories. Look, the myth of Roswell is part and parcel certainly to Area 51, certainly to the idea that the government keeps secrets, that the military keeps secrets. That is when allegedly a UFO crashed and the military stepped in and, took the evidence away. It links up to Area 51, as I said, because this source of mine told me that he was part of the team that years later received what crashed at Roswell at Area 51. And this is the origin story of the alien myth of Area 51. Tell me what you've... I mean, everyone has a different interpretation of it. So this is perspective, POV. Tell me yours. These are documented facts. And, like the JFK conspiracy, there are numerous people, we can't even put a number on it, that spend so much time going over the precise details. I go over them broadly, but you mentioned the most important ones that are, and I think they're, when I say the most important, because they are actually what we would call fact-checkable, And when you have big mysteries and considerable discrepancies within the fact-checkable information, I think it's fair to raise questions about what actually went on and why are you covering this up? Because there is a cover-up if you're going to change your story. I'm not familiar with any of the caller's books that he talked about. Yes, but I tend to read more nonfiction than fiction. But as for the current administration, I attempt to stay out of politics. And this is why, is because I think it's more valuable to maintain neutrality in terms of political systems, agendas, etc. Because I'm reporting on the intelligence community and the Defense Department, and that doesn't change. I mean, the leader, the commander-in-chief changes, but many of those individuals are entrenched. And I know and work with many people on both sides of the aisle, and I see their point. I see both sides of the aisle's points. So I'm more interested in the battle, I'm more interested in the individual quest, and I'm most interested in the outcome. Well, that's a perfect question segued into the previous question, and here's why. When I was working on Paperclip, my editor and I would have conversations about making sure that I was showing both sides of the argument, okay? And if there was any book that I was prone to having an opinion about, it was Operation Paperclip, okay? And I'm not Jewish, by the way, right? Because of my last name, many people say, oh, she's Jewish, she's going to side with the, But what was interesting to me is that I did try to maintain that neutrality, and I think I may have succeeded, and here's why. Because I tried to show also why there was an argument that it was important to bring the Nazi scientists here to beat back the Russians. So was it a moral compromise? I'm telling you here on Book TV that in my opinion, yes, it felt that way when I was writing it. My job as a journalist was to show both sides of the aisle. I was on one television program that leans right, let's say, and they said, Annie, I'm so glad you wrote this book. You showed part and parcel why we had to have this program. We had to have it. Yes, the Nazis were terrible, but we needed to bring them here because we had to win the Cold War. I could be on another show that would lean left, and they would say, Annie, thank you for writing this book. You show that this was morally reprehensible. We absolutely never, ever should have brought these Nazis here, no matter what. You show it part and parcel, thank you. They read the same book, which speaks to my curiosity about perspective, about how people interpret the same facts. And that is part of human nature. The ability that we have to see things our way. I think where things get really interesting is when you have, some would call it a change of heart, others would call it a change of mind. That's what interested me in phenomena in particular, because almost everyone who works in that world has what's called a conversion moment, where they have a change of heart, where they have a change of mind, their life changes, and the results are dramatic. Yes, and because I didn't interview him and I didn't interview any of his family members, it's hard to really know the reality behind that. And I mean the motivations, let's say, because there's no way of knowing if it was personally motivated, like from the heart, or whether it was a motivation from his handlers at NASA who said, listen, if you pull some good old, religion into the mix here, you're going to be more appealing to the average American than the former, Nazi scientist with a strong German accent. Not that I know of, but, I wouldn't doubt it, because all of this science is interconnected in an interesting way. And we in America, the defense scientists are always looking at what's happening around the world, going back to that theme that we cannot be beaten, we cannot be overtaken by technological surprise. That's what happened with Sputnik in 1958. They made it into space before we did, and that has never happened since. So there is good reason to say, wow, DARPA is doing its job. Human testing is an infinitely interesting and problematic area. In Operation Paperclip, I write about the origins of the Nuremberg Code. And then in Area 51, I write about how the Nuremberg Code was defied by our scientists working for the Atomic Energy Commission, conducting human experiments related to radiation. Really nefarious experiments that were made transparent by the Clinton administration. These are worthy documents, very important to look at, because it shows you what is possible, right? What is possible flying in the face of something like the Nuremberg Code. I'm always on the lookout for that kind of work, for those kind of operations programs. I did not find any that the reader is specifically referring to. I write about Project 57 at length in Area 51, and it was a fascinating test because we did do that plutonium dispersal. And I tell it through the perspective of the security guard out there at the time, a man by the name of Richard Mingus. And it's extraordinary what went on, the kind of fast and loose operations that the AEC was conducting. I also write about cloud sampling because that is part and parcel to this, because many of the test pilots who I interviewed for Area 51, including the great Hervey Stockman, who was the first man to fly over the Soviet Union in a U-2. This is in 1956, bringing home photographs of 400,000 square feet of the Soviet Union that had been unseen by the intelligence community before. Stockman then went on and was was a nuclear test pilot and flew directly through some of those clouds that are being discussed here. So again, this all kind of loops around together. The different threads come out in different ways. That was the CIA's first spy plane program. They called it Eyes in the Sky. And it was the U-2, and then when the U-2, you know, so much of this is about we do this and then the Soviets would beat us, or Soviets would beat us back, right? So we built the U-2 to fly high enough that would be out of range of Soviet surface-to-air missiles. Well, then they built up their surface-to-air missiles. Suddenly you have the Gary Powers incident, gets shot down. So the CIA starts building this new airplane that we talked about called the Oxcart, and that was this incredibly secret project at Area 51. Many of the same scientists, Edward Lovick, who gave me my original scoop, worked on the U-2, then worked on Oxcart. I found that out, much to my astonishment, when I was writing Area 51, and I was talking to a source about this incredibly secret program that allegedly involved human, experiments out there, the crossover with the aliens. And I said, how come this was not uncovered during the Clinton administration, when so much of these nefarious human experiments out at the test site became public? And the source said the president did not have a need to know. That is an interesting statement. Von Braun? He worked in the defense contracting industry, but from my read on documents about him from the government is that, after the Apollo program ended so abruptly, it was extraordinarily distressing to him. I mean, where do you go from there? It was such a high to be the kind of most famous scientist in the country during the Apollo era. And then, people gave up on that program. Very difficult time, Vietnam War. And von Braun, sort of the way I read it, lost his, he lost his way, and he became despondent. And I write about that in Paperclip. And then he's diagnosed with cancer, and he died very, very quickly. I think you nailed it with that last program. That's one of the more interesting ones I know about, and I write about it in the Pentagon's Brain. The way I would approach that answer is to say, if you look back at the technology in the 1960s with the A-12 Oxcart, and you consider going 2,400 miles an hour, then, under these secret programs, you can kind of figure out what must be going on today based on the information that you talked about, the programs that we know about, and then you kind of can, speculate on what is unknown. And again, those programs are kept secret because they are part and parcel to national security. I mean, the air has always been an important space to dominate for the Defense Department. This gets into the downfall of the program because you had some of the soldiers who had been trained to be psychic retiring from the military and taking it upon themselves to offer their services outside the military. And that is that situation you're talking about. Now, that led to a grave problem because the protocols involved in remote viewing at that time were still classified. And so by bringing the very subject to the public, that was a press release on that because the journalists found that interesting, as they should. And then the kibosh was put on that, and it took a couple more years for the program to really be revealed. But that was a former soldier going outside of the military, offering private services to the UN. That's a good question. Not specifically related to Area 51. Certainly the numbers of people interested in that are phenomenal. But, and yes, there are revelations all the time, but I think Lazar learned an interesting, came to an interesting conclusion, certainly in my interview with him, about what happens if you reveal something that you're not supposed to reveal. And the Defense Department learned how to deal with people who say outlandish things, or people who say things that they can spin as outlandish, or, you know, reflect as outlandish. And so, and also keep in mind, when Lazier made his declaration, I mean, the world was a totally different place in terms of our smartphones. You know, information is king now, and you can learn so many different things in so many different ways. So it doesn't have the same power that Lazier had going on ABC TV. I mean, that was a big deal. I requested to go with Ed Lovick, you know. I presented it as, wouldn't this be a terrific way to make transparent to the public? And, you know, their response is brilliant. I mean, it's always true to form. And they, you know, they spin around the facts because they can't actually say. I refer to it as Groom Lake, thinking maybe they would, you know, take the bait, but they didn't. And of course, they just, it's like your request to go somewhere that can't even really say exists has been denied. There are all kinds of areas out at the Nevada test site, and they're divided up. All of them involve nuclear testing. Area 13 was where there was the plutonium test. Area 25 was where they were building a spaceship that was going to take us to Mars using nuclear weapons technology. I mean, you could write a different book about every one of those areas out there. Area 51 is kind of like north in a different direction because it's inside the test site. But Nellis has always played an interesting role because there are stories abound about pilots who, because everybody knows you cannot fly over Area 51, and every now and then there's kind of like someone puts their wing into the tip of the box, so to speak, and there's kind of a report, most of which is redacted. But yes, they work hand in glove and always have. I mean, that part of the country with all these different classified areas out there, if you look at a map between China Lake in California and you look in Area 51 in Nevada, the test site, these are huge swaths of land where classified military technology is fully underway. They really want to be able to control the message, I think, more than anything. And the idea is, well, if you keep a journalist out, you're definitely controlling the message because they're not in. So that is an ongoing source of frustration, I think, because I do think that there's a responsibility by government to try and make the facts known and to try and make some of these facilities available to people like myself. But what DARPA said, you know, which they do have a good point, they are not a laboratory. It's just administration that's going on there, or so they say. So they were saying, you're gonna do better visiting the actual laboratories, and so I did. You know, I don't know of an official position, but you can definitely, I could, in reading the documents, you could get a sense of, I don't want to say disappointment, but that's the word that comes to mind. You know, they like individuals who are part of their big programs to stick with stick with the message, so to speak. And, you know, he had some wild ideas. He became very interested in the idea about aliens toward the end of his life, and he spoke about it at length. And I think a lot of the, you know, you kind of go where the love is, right, for lack of a better expression. And so he's getting a lot of, let's say, even nastiness from NASA. I mean, they brought a lawsuit against him at one point over some equipment. So, and he's being embraced by individuals who lean towards some what I would call conspiratorial ideas about aliens. And he definitely leaned toward that way. And again, it cost him, you know. But I find that really interesting. What I also found fascinating was Mitchell's relationship with Uri Geller, because I interviewed Geller at length in Phenomena, and I found him to be extraordinarily interesting and dynamic. I also wound up at Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's house when I was with Uri Geller in Israel, raising extraordinary questions about whether or not he works for Mossad, which is why he left the CIA program. But, you know, when I interviewed Mitchell, he spoke so highly of Geller, and when I interviewed Geller, he spoke so highly of Mitchell. They were like foils for one another. To Mitchell, Uri Geller represented everything that is possible, that idea of the far reaches of man and his biological capabilities. And to Geller, Mitchell represented the great explorer, the great hero, because he was young when Mitchell went to the moon. He was in his 20s, and he told me that Ed Mitchell, knowing about Geller's, you know, telepathy experiments and his public persona, Mitchell sent him a photograph of himself on the moon and signed it and, you know, said the equivalent of "Go Uri." And Geller said this just made him feel amazing in this moment of doubt, because he was being attacked publicly by James Randi and every other scientific skeptic and really dragged through the mud. And he said Mitchell gave him the kind of, you know, the stamina and the energy and the hopefulness to go forward. So they just have this fascinating friendship over the decades that I found really mysterious. I mean, how did we get there? The quest narrative. I was interviewing Geller in Israel, and I had specifically wanted to spend a lot of time with him because I figured that if he was a magician and he was doing this act by predigitation, what, you know, Randi and others do, magicians can bend spoons by just, you know, a trick. I figured if I spent enough time with Geller, I might be able to see, you know, a crack in the veil, so to speak, which I never saw. I mean, I was with him for several days, for like 8 and 10 hours a day, walking all over Tel Aviv, and everywhere we went. I mean, he's so famous. He's the most famous person in Israel, it seems like. And everyone asked him to bend a spoon, and he did. And, you know, I mean, in these remarkable circumstances, and big soup spoons in a kitchen once, in a restaurant. I mean, it was really, I saw it happen. I mean, it was just, you know, and he doesn't really necessarily touch the spoon. That's what I found fascinating. I saw him bend a pair of hookah tongs for 2 North Africans who were there. And, you know, hookah tongs are crafted to withstand extraordinary heat. And he did that. You know, the hookah tongs are like this, and he kind of held his finger. It was remarkable. But the one situation I was curious about, and I told him I wasn't really buying, was this idea that he worked for the Mossad. Because he told me that when he was a little boy, that had been his dream. So I wondered, going back to this archetype, the idea of Jung, right? Oh, maybe this is his kind of childhood fantasy. And I said that to him. I'm not buying it. And what would the Mossad need you for, the spoon bender? And he got angry with me. And, you know, he has a very big ego by his own admittance. And then a few hours later, we rock up to the residence of the Prime Minister. And what was amazing is everybody knew Uri Geller. I mean, the agents, the protective detail, hey, you know, will you bend a spoon for us? And he was bending spoons. And it just had this very surreal quality to it of like, there is something going on here that's outside the scope of, you know, the journalists need to know. And I found it really fascinating. And then, of course, we were sitting there in the residence, and then Geller disappeared into the back. And I wondered, is this how the Mossad works? I don't know. It's a mystery. It makes me more of a sheep than a goat, you know? I mean, that kind of experience. But really, it makes me open to the idea. I mean, that's what Schmeidler said in that scale. It's like, I'm open to the idea because I'm open to the idea of it's a quest to determine to think about and what can be known, what is man capable of. And if you think of the world we live in now and this astonishing rate of technology, you know, Jung said it, when he and the Nobel laureate physicist Wolfgang Pauli were discussing ESP. They had a decades-long debate. ESP, is it fact or fantasy? And Jung said, you can only judge what is possible by the criteria of the age, right? So think about what we've been talking about this for hours now, where we are now with computer technology. I mean, where we are with space travel. This was science fiction decades ago, and now it's all possible. So if you allow yourself to hold that idea and not be so judgmental against these ideas that, yes, for millennium have been, you know, aligned with the supernatural, have been aligned with magic. But if you can just hold the idea and think about it, I think there is more to be revealed. So, UFO, unidentified flying object. I write about this at length in Area 51, unidentified flying object. There are two sides of the aisle, those who say they come from another galaxy, let's say, and those who say they are unidentified flying aircraft, meaning they are still classified projects. And one thing I can tell you for certain is that UFOs were part and parcel to the early days of Area 51 because the U-2 was often mistaken for a UFO. The ox cart was often mistaken for a UFO. And I interview the pilots and the scientists who were working on this and the officials from the government who were in charge of putting the kibosh on those reports. Sometimes people who saw them, and again, what they were seeing was the ox cart, okay? And they would see this shiny object going at a speed that wasn't humanly possible because 2,400 miles an hour was an unknown speed to be able to fly in the early 1960s. So the FBI would knock at the door and, you know, literally pay a visit to the people who reported these to let them know that they didn't see anything strange. And that created its own new conspiracy, because if the FBI shows up at your door and tells them you didn't see something that you know you saw. Now, that's not to completely disregard all of those individuals who firmly believe they have seen things in the skies that cannot be explained. I just think they're different sides of the argument. Someone who spent decades trying to get someone to read what I was writing, yes, that surprises me. It's the best kind of surprise. No one was buying the great American novel from Annie Jacobsen, you know. I mean, I think it's important to sort of pivot to where the work is, you know. And when I say work, I mean, you know, employment. When I became a reporter, that really changed things for me, because I was able to accept that so much of writing, at least for me, is craft. You know, it's just stay at it and keep at it, and ultimately you will find and narrate the story. I mean, they're actually in television development, and my new book, Phenomena, was just optioned by Steven Spielberg's Amblin and Jason Blum's Blumhouse. So it's amazing because you have sort of the old guard, you know, E.T., right, and Close Encounters. I mean, let's face it, Spielberg built this genre in the fictional world. Well, in the modern fictional world. And then you have Blumhouse, who are responsible for not only the horror genre becoming so popular, they do all the paranormal activities, but they also make really interesting movies like Whiplash, documentaries like The Jinx, and those projects are all about what makes you uncomfortable. And I think in dealing with phenomena, this squishy science idea, this idea that's the center of a battle between the skeptics and the supernaturalists, it makes people really uncomfortable because, you know, they think one thing and then they talk to the other side and they think that thing. I mean, I find that super interesting because we have to ultimately, you know, come to terms with our own belief set, but a lot of times it's a process. The amazing thing about film and television is they're sort of the gentle way in to many of these subjects, and they spark an interest in the nonfiction world, I think. They work part and parcel. They team up, so they're like two great teams, and then the content is created of how to move forward. I mean, you see that Operation Paperclip is in development with Brad Pitt's company, which is called Plan B, and Rat Pack, which is Brett Ratner's company, and they team up. So a lot of times you have, and Pentagon's brain, you have J.J. Abrams' Bad Robot, the people behind Star Wars, working with Warner Brothers. So, and Area 51, AMC, you know, with Gail Ann Hurd, the woman who co-wrote The Terminator. But again, I think these science fiction is super interesting to a lot of people for my favorite theme, the reaches of what can be known. So much of science fiction winds up becoming the truth. And in fact, so many scientists, famous scientists, Nobel laureates tell me that their ideas come from reading science fiction as a child. You know, that idea of what the future may be like is very interesting to me. And I like cautionary tales because you can see what you want to avoid, or what you hope to avoid. You know, the idea of dystopia is a spooky one, particularly important. This speaks to the Pentagon's brain. The last chapters in the Pentagon's brain, I wrote about DARPA's quest to create a synthetic brain, you know, and my visit out to Los Alamos to meet with those scientists who are working on that. Will artificial intelligence lead us to a place that, you know, George Orwell would have written about, or did write about, or will it liberate us? You know, it's that Eisenhower question. I mean, how do security and liberty live side by side? And now that artificial intelligence is such a major player everywhere, you know, the quest for it, because of course we have, whether or not we will achieve true sentience in machines was something von Neumann predicted, but we have yet to know. But the Defense Department is certainly moving in the direction of marrying autonomous weapons, drones, with artificial intelligence. I see danger in that. I see the cautionary tale. Look, the capabilities of the government are extensive, you know, in terms of surveillance. And I write about that in all of my books. I just really keep my nose clean, meaning I'm just after the facts. And I talk to scientists who worked on very secret, very classified military programs, and they are aware of what they can say and what they cannot say. And that's really where the risk is. So I'm very grateful that scientists agree to talk to me, because it would perhaps be easier to say, I can't, because they're the ones that have to toe that line and, you know, keep these ideas in their mind. Okay, I can talk about that program and I can't talk about that, because you cannot disclose classified information, period. And that's the risk that they take, which is a far greater risk, I think, than me as a reporter writing narrative nonfiction. The chipping technology is very controversial. I mean, yes, there's the chips in the body for identification purposes. I mean, civilians do that as well. So, but there's also the chip in the brain programs that I write about in the Pentagon's brain that I think are far more of concern. And again, they're presented by DARPA under the rubric of warrior wellness, under this idea that brain-wounded soldiers can, you know, have a chip in their brain, and they can work on these programs to, you know, bring back some cognition. But this is a very slippery slope area, and even the Jason scientists who I interviewed advised the Pentagon not to go in that direction for fear of, and this was an exact quote, it could lead to, you know, high quality brain control. And when you have again, that cautionary tale idea, when you have a warning from a group of scientists who have been advising the Pentagon for decades, and the Pentagon chooses to ignore that, I think it's important that those facts be known, and then the citizenry can decide whether or not they think this is a good idea, putting chips anywhere in people's bodies. And that's always the argument. So you really have to say is who's pushing the science where and why, right? And yes, DARPA is absolutely, you know, on the cutting edge of all these technologies, but the Russians also have a DARPA, and so do the Chinese. So many of these subjects are covered in Area 51, and from Lockheed, Teller, Lazar. Again, these are all ideas. If you think about going back to what we were just talking about, what is possible in any age, okay? The idea of strange things in the sky has been an issue that people have thought about and contemplated and created art about going back till pre-civilization. I visited the British Museum while I was writing The Phenomena and looked at the earliest examples of what people thought were UFOs. I looked at cuneiform writings from King Ashburnapal's library, omens, divination. Rulers back in 600 BC would say, who will win the war? I went to the Oracle at Delphi to kind of read and feel what it was like to work with prophecy. So prophecy, UFOs, man, civilization, biology, what is possible. These are all part and parcel to all the subjects I investigate. And I just love the fact that there are ideas that exist, and we look as journalists, we go into the documentation, we interview people, we present the stories as best. I present the stories that I do in my books as best as I can based on eyewitnesses, based on documentation, and based on the work of other journalists before me who have laid the tracks down. And so the story is always evolving and changing and transforming, but ultimately it's going in that direction about, what do we know about the past and how can we use that as we move forward in the future and make sense of this world that we live in, where technology is advancing at this astonishing rate, and yet we and our ideas, our brains, are still relatively the same. Well, many scientists talk about that idea of knowledge, kind of the same discoveries cropping up in different parts of the world at the same time. And that is super interesting. I mean, one of the themes that I write about in Phenomena that I did not, that is new to my sort of, works, if you will, speaks a little bit to the reader's question and to your point, and it has to do with this idea of where does inspiration come from, okay? The eureka moment. And I'll tell a story about the great Charles Townes and what he told me in our interview. Now, Charles Townes won the Nobel Prize in the early 1960s for the laser, okay? Arguably one of the most important technological inventions of the modern era. I mean, military applications, laser weapons, civilian use, eye surgery, the laser printer. And I bring this up because the scientific skeptics always go crazy on this idea. And on balance, when you think that the idea I'm about to tell you comes from Charles Townes, okay, it kind of puts things in perspective. So I asked him to confirm with me a kind of story that was out there about him, that the idea of the laser came to him while he was sitting on a park bench. And he said, yes, that is right. That was his eureka moment. Now, Townes, we learn, is a man of faith. So that eureka moment to him, in his view of the world and in his perspective, was something that came to him from the supernatural, okay? And this, I think, speaks to the caller's questions about where are these ideas coming from? And some people, the sheep, will tell you that great moments are not limited to, I came up with this idea myself sitting at my desk. There are 3 Nobel laureates I write in the book who all talk about these eureka moments and who believe that these ideas come from without. And I think the whole world and the narratives of aliens and higher intelligence, maybe even consciousness, that is touching upon that theory that there is a greater intelligence out there. And I think that it's not, I think it's unwise, for me anyways, to dismiss this whole cloth, to take the position of the goat and essentially ridicule it. I think the idea of being open to it is far more interesting and far more courageous. Thank you so much. Another theme that I'm always writing about, because when you see some of the programs declassified and you realize what was at issue, what was at stake, there is very good reason in many instances to keep those programs classified so that the other side doesn't, isn't aware of that, and then it remains a true defensive measure. There lies the conundrum of the military-industrial complex, and I think the caller's question is actually brilliant, because the military-industrial complex exists for a purpose for national security. But if their goal is to speed up the revelations, then you also have what one Defense Department official described to me as a self-licking ice cream cone, right? So in other words, if you could have a great weapon system that stayed classified, and the other intelligence community on the other side knew about it and couldn't defend against it, and the goal was to keep the two powers in check, then essentially you have an effective weapon system. But the minute that system becomes known, like the F-117, then that becomes obsolete, and it creates an entire new vacuum, i.e. new business for the defense contractors to create a new weapon system. So it's a brilliant question, and I think there is no easy answer, but the investigator in me is infinitely interested in pursuing that thought and finding out what I can, and presenting those facts to the public. I mean, that's a great question, but I don't know, because I think really and truly, the unknowable programs are the most interesting, and it never ceases to amaze me when you learn about a program that no one knew about before. Then you really know the government's doing its job of keeping things secret. But if I had to say, looking back, I think the weapons tests that we did in space are extremely interesting, and I know that a lot of those are still classified because I've reported on those, and that speaks to the space race. And there is talk right now with the current administration of rebooting the space race. I think that is extraordinarily dangerous for a number of reasons, and first and foremost because they're also talking about perhaps a return to nuclear testing. That's frightening. And if you look at the weapons tests that were done in space, you get a sense of how dangerous this all can be. I mean, it depends who you ask about the remains. I write about that in Area 51. I think that's one of those mysteries, and maybe to your earlier caller, if there was a program that could be declassified, can you imagine if Roswell was really declassified? I love it. I love getting out there on the road and talking to people who like to read. It reminds me of that image that we talked about of Edgar Mitchell, the man on the moon reading, And you think about this idea, the archetype of reading, of knowledge. I often say I have the best job in the world. I mean, I get to write books and listen to what readers think about and what the experience of reading the books, and then how it influences them in their lives and their thinking, and as they become more of an alert and knowledgeable part of the citizenry. Yes, I mean, I write about them in the book, Phenomena, because that's that conversion moment for a lot of people where they have a near-death experience and they come back from that with extreme conviction about what they are now going to pursue. And it often has, as the caller explained, to do with consciousness. What is the brain capable of? Because if you go somewhere else, come back, you certainly have a different perspective. And I find that super interesting. Absolutely. Human physiology. I mean, that's where we are today with the ESP programs. Instead of the parapsychologists, you have neurobiologists, neurophysiologists looking inside the brain and inside the body and working to map the human brain. Is a remarkable concept, particularly when you put the military in the mix, because the military is working to enhance human functioning, enhance cognition, and ultimately to weaponize these systems. Are there civilian applications? Like all things, there is dual use.